started. Okay, I know people are still streaming in, but it looks like we've got a critical mass, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Welcome, my name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping momentarily into the chat to purchase The Revenge of Power: How Autocrats Are Reinventing Politics for the 21st Century. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, just click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's event. Moisés Naím's The Revenge of Power is an urgent, thrilling, and original look at the future of democracy. It illuminates one of the most important battles of our time, the future of freedom and how to contain and defeat the autocrats mushrooming around the world. Naím is a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an internationally syndicated columnist. He served as editor-in-chief of foreign policy, as Venezuela's trade minister, and as an executive director of the World Bank. Naím will be in conversation with Carlos Lozada. He is the nonfiction book critic of the Washington Post. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2019 and received the 2015 National Book Critics Circle's Citation for Excellence in Reviewing. Previously, he was managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine and a fellow in economics and business journalism at Columbia University. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the screen over to you gentlemen. Take it away.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you very much.
It is such an honor to be here tonight with Moisés Naím. And before we kick off, I just want to indulge in a completely personal digression here. I was in graduate school in the mid-90s when I read Moisés's book, Paper Tigers and Minotaurs, about his experience implementing economic reform in Venezuela. And I actually have my old copy here, all marked up. 5 years later, I was lucky enough to find myself working with Moisés as an editor at Foreign Policy magazine, where he was the editor-in-chief. That was my first job in journalism, for which I remain endlessly grateful. I was there when he was working on his book, Illicit, which I also have here, about the underground global economy. And later I read and admired his book, The End of Power, published in 2013. I apologize, I still have not yet read Two Spies in Caracas, Moisés's novel. As you can tell, it's hard to keep up with him. But in any case, tonight feels like a homecoming of sorts for me. I want to begin by trying to connect these books in a way, or at least the two most recent ones, the two most recent nonfiction ones. The End of Power was about how smaller players in global affairs, in business, in politics, in civil society, were constraining the exercise of power by the bigger players, how being in charge was not what it used to be. Now, several years later, Moisés, you're writing about the revenge of power, the consolidation of power by autocratic leaders. How did we get from the end of power to the revenge?
Well, first of all, thank you, Carlos, for doing this. Thank you for your kind words. And it's one of the privileges of my professional life has been working with you. And thank you very much for doing this. And thanks to Politics and Prose for creating the opportunity. How did I go from the end of power to the revenge of power? Well, it took a decade. A decade when I saw the old incumbents develop new ways to hold off the challenges they faced. A decade when we saw an explosive growth in political influence and financial success of social media. When China's Xi Jinping changed the rules and concentrated power and eliminated term limits, as did Vladimir Putin. Both developed strong geopolitical appetites. Their countries and the borders were not enough. They wanted a larger global presence and participation. It was also where a new way of attacking democracy saw success. In every continent on Earth is a decade where Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey took power. They took power masquerading as democrats, but they wielded it as autocrats. It is worth noting here that the weakening of power, the fragmentation of power that you described, the way I did it in my last book, is not and should be not conceived of as mutually exclusive with other forces that concentrate power. You can have simultaneity in which in some aspects of countries, some institutions, you see a weakening, a fragmentation of power. And in others, you see concentration of power. There are countries in which power is becoming more concentrated. Just take a look at today's Russia. But at the same time, are other countries that have a hard time keeping it together. And fragmentation and the weakening of power becomes the norm. And so this book is an attempt to show the intertwining of both, of the forces that spread, fragment, and spread power, and the forces that concentrate power. Those who had power were not going to just sit back and see how the new incumbents and the new challengers were going to take their power. They reacted, and they reacted with a very surprising set of tools that popped up around the world, really. And even in very different countries, they ended up using the same tricks, tactics, and strategies to access power and retain it.
One of the strengths of the Revenge of Power, and if for those of you participating on the Zoom who read Moisés regularly, you know this is a thing he does, is the book's ability to both introduce and just distill concepts that seem simple, but then help us understand a variety of trends, big and small in the world. I hope we can touch on a few of those concepts tonight. One that really guides the book is the notion of what you call the 3 Ps, and then you refer to the 3P autocrats. Can you describe for all of us what the 3 Ps are and how you kind of hit on that on those concepts as the key to the story?
I was looking at what was going on with power around the world, and it was so complicated and so opaque, and so we had a bunch of concepts jumping around, and all with some grain of truth. But I felt that for my own understanding, I needed a synthesis. I needed to have a basic way, an essential way of understanding and explaining what was going on. And then I grouped them, all these factors, all these players, all these strategies in 3 Ps: populism, polarization, and post-truth. They're not new. Each one of those has existed forever. But they are new in terms of the 21st century technologies, society, distribution of power internationally and domestically. So they are intertwined in ways that make them different and harder to grasp. Populism, for example, is often confused with ideology. And it is not. Populism is a very old trick of divide and conquer that allows a leader to access to power and keep it by dividing, by talking about the noble people that he's representing, defending them from the voracity of a horrible elite that needs to be constrained and eliminated from political life. And here was always a messianic leader, a charismatic leader that offered the opportunity to make right for all of these people, the noble people exploited by the elites. And then there is polarization. Look around democracies around the world, and you will see that all of them are highly polarized. Society has always been polarized in terms of the division of issues and division over identities, over ideologies, interests, regions, and so on. But the 21st century has given us a new way of practicing polarization. A way that is so extreme that doesn't allow for the traditional type of rivalries that at the end allowed countries to govern themselves. I always say that polarization is like cholesterol. There is good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. There is good polarization and bad polarization. Good polarization is the one that allows the exchanges, the attacks and the defenses of different groups, but end up having an agreement that allows the country to be governed. Bad polarization is the one that makes the division so deep that makes it impossible for the polarized groups to act to find some level of consensus. And all of this, of course, is nurtured, amplified, and added with great potency by post-truth, which is, in the past, we used to call it propaganda. But this is bigger than propaganda. This is not just a minister like Goebbels, that was Hitler's minister of propaganda, or there is a ministry of propaganda in China. This is not that. This is that plus a society where the diffusion of post-truth and lies, it becomes a matter of individuals even. And when you combine these three P's, you get the highly confusing, highly risky, highly threatening, bewildering political reality that we have today. I apologize, I spoke too long, but I needed to.
No, that was really useful. I think polarization as cholesterol is a classic way that Moisés is able to distill an idea so you can't forget it. Now, it's impossible to read this book and not think about what's happening right now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin is a recurring character in your book as one of the 3P autocrats. How does this latest move fit into the structure and argument of the revenge of power?
Well, in the book, and even before the invasion of Ukraine, I have 118 references to Putin. He was surely an element of an important example of the sort of things I wanted to illustrate. And as you know, Carlos, there is no better way of illustrating a trend than finding an extremist, finding an illustrative extreme, and he provides that. In order to justify invading Ukraine, for example, he went to the farthest extreme of populism, polarization, and post-truth. He portrayed the poor Russian speakers in Ukraine as under a threat from a government controlled by corrupt Western influence elites. To polarize the conflict he went so far as to say that the elected government in Kyiv, which is led by a Jewish person, practices Nazism. He went to the farthest edges of post-truth, saying that Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine are being subjected to genocide. So he would say anything. And as with any populist, he portrayed himself as the only messianic savior who can protect the pure people of Ukraine from Kiev's exploitative elite. Demonizing those who don't think like you, demonizing your rivals, demonizing the past, declaring that nothing that came before is acceptable, is part of the toolkit. We have seen Putin do this since the beginning, including launching the war that cemented his power in the late 90s, that resulted in large-scale loss of innocent civilians in Chechnya. Talk about post-truth and the control of truth in Russia today. The media doesn't talk about an invasion; they talk about a military operation. Most Russians are not well informed or not informed at all about all of the characteristics of what's going on, and frankly, the reaction of the world. Your average Russian does not know that the world has reacted in a way that is surprising everyone, probably, very likely even Putin.
You know, one of the details in the book that is very memorable to me is you mention how the Soviets created the office, the Special Disinformation Office, back in 1923. It's so easy to think of Russian disinformation efforts as, you know, a product of a modern tactic of the social media age. You know, we're in fact approaching the 100th anniversary of the creation of that office, beginning under Stalin. So that was a way to kind of bring this home for me in your book. You know, one other, I'm a big sports fan, and one of the big criticisms of Washington political journalism is that you know, journalists treat politics as sports. You know, who wins, who loses, who's up, who's down, rather than engaging in the substance of it. So I was very interested to see that one of your explanations for how populist, polarizing, and post-truth leaders take power is through the dynamics of fandom, as in sports. You know, rooting for your team, despising the other team. How does fandom help us understand the rise of these kind of leaders?
There has always been an emotional relationship between charismatic leaders and their followers. But what happens under the 3P autocrats is different. Their audiences respond to these leaders precisely in the same way that you respond to your favorite sport club, as others follow their heroes in sport or entertainment. Followers of the Yankees or the Barça, the Barcelona Soccer Club, have a relationship with these entities or these individuals that goes beyond charisma. The messianic leader, the populist leader, also is always very charismatic. It always has the ability to create a very strong bond with his followers. But this goes beyond the charisma. This goes to an attachment, even an identity. People, parts of people's identities is the people they support, the sports clubs that they admire, and the entertainers that they are very special. So they develop a kind of a very strong psychological bond that then allows the 3P autocrats ask them to do anything and everything. And, you know, here a good example is also Donald Trump. Donald Trump elicits among some of his followers sentiments and feelings of affiliation, of identity, of loyalty, of fealty, that allow, you know, the famous phrase of Donald Trump, you know, I can go down on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and nothing would happen. Well, that is a complete extreme manifestation of the type of bond that people have. And that's fandom, the politics of fandom, that is not just promoted by journalists, but also by the 3P autocrats that need that as part of the menu that they use to retain and stay in power.
One of the other details that I hadn't known about till I read your book was when you said that that Max Weber, the sociologist, had described charisma as being about that bond, right? That it's not just the personality of the leader, but it's about the bond with the followers, and that speaks to exactly what you're highlighting. Another concept that I hope you can unpack for us is that of pseudo-law, which you compared to pseudoscience, right? Pseudo-law is real law in a procedural sense, but not in a substantive sense. What makes pseudo-law? What makes a law a pseudo-law? And can you give us some examples of how they've been introduced in practice?
Well, the book and the central idea is that there is a lot that happens with the 3P autocrats that is stealthy, that is opaque, that is not well known. And one aspect of that is, of course, pseudo-law. It makes you, you know, it has all the theatrical and all of the mores of law, but in fact, it is not. There is a very famous statement by, I don't remember now, but it says, to my friends, everything, to my enemies, the law. And that tells you how law is weaponized for power. But it's not just law, it's the parliament, the theory that you have an independent parliament. Well, the Duma, which is the lower house of the Russian parliament, in 22 years has never voted against any initiative promoted by Putin. The independent media, the notion that you have independent media, you have a bunch of TV stations in Hungary, for example, or the media. They were all purchased by cronies of the government and funded by the government. So Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, can go around and say, well, we have a free media here. You know, there's private investors that own the media here, but it just happens that all of them toe the government's line, and they don't have any real journalism, independent journalism. The same with the institution, the legal institution, the Supreme Court. One of the first things that these leaders do is to try to take control, to control the Supreme Court, because from there they can then use a lot of other things. So it's pseudo-law, but it's also pseudo-parliament and pseudo-elections. One of the interesting phenomena of our time is democracy in the last 15 years has been declining. The number of countries that are democracies, the number of people that live on democracies has been declining. So democracy is declining. But at the same time, elections are booming. The number of elections is extraordinary. As we speak now, there is an election somewhere in the world for something, for president of the country, for prime minister, or for state and local authorities, or for mayors of a city, or, you know, all kinds of elections are taking place. How do you square the fact that democracy is declining and elections are booming? Well, because a lot of those elections are sham elections. They're not really elections. So ask yourself, why Putin, who everybody knows controls everything, or tries to control everything in Russia, stages election? Why does he still have to play that game if everybody knows that the election is going to go his way, in the same way that happens in a lot of these autocracies? Well, because they need the legitimacy that even an illegal sham election bestows on a leader. And so even that is a sham, is a pseudo election where, you know, has all the trappings of an election, it has all the campaign, but everybody knows that at the end, the incumbent autocrat will win by a very large margin.
Moisés, you point out in the book that when we discuss polarization in modern politics, we often use euphemisms like economic anxiety or victimhood or resentment. You use a tougher, harsher word for it, revenge. That the thirst for vengeance allows an anti-democratic leader to consolidate power. How does that work in practice?
If I try to mobilize you and make you follow me, I need to promise you things. If I take you to the economic realm, it's going to be very hard for me to fulfill my promise. High performance in these countries, high economic performance, or the difficulties of managing the economy, you know, bringing prosperity to the people is a very difficult chore. But revenge, everybody can identify to that. So if I want to polarize you, I will essentially tell you a story of how you and your family have been abused by this greedy elite, that the past was very nefarious for you and your family and your group, and therefore revenge, promising revenge, even if it doesn't solve my problem, even if it doesn't give me a job or have better public services or less corruption, even none of that happens, but revenge delivers. And so economic prosperity, difficult. Revenge, for sure.
You mentioned one of the lines that really stuck with me is you say the aspiring 3P autocrats find their ideal hunting ground not among the poor, but among the disappointed. And I think that's a perfect way to explain this kind of thirst for for vengeance. You write about another concept in the book that may not be familiar to everyone, anti-politics, and you say the anti-politics is captured in that phrase, que se vayan todos, throw them all out. How does anti-politics help us understand this moment?
I am sure that you and everyone that is joining us in this conversation has met someone that says, I don't care about politics. They're all crooks. They're all there to make it for the families and friends. And they steal and they're incompetent and they're politicians because they don't know anything else. So it's essentially a disdain, a profound disdain, a profound resentment, a profound disrespect for politics. In many cases, very well earned by the politicians that are derided. But this is the story of not knowing what to expect from democracy. And confusing some of them. Democracy is a mess, is often late in coming to the right policies. It is distorted by special interests. It has all the list of deficiencies of democracies are well known, but it's still, our only way to protect freedom. And the alternative, we can see around what are the alternatives, the strong hands of the strong man. And so, que se vayan todos. That was a phrase commonly used in Latin America. Essentially, throw them out. In Venezuela was a leader of that. And we threw them out, all of them. And you know who came instead? Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez. And look, the country, Venezuela, was a very defective country, had many problems, but it had a working, active, competitive democracy. It had prosperity. There was food on the supermarkets. There was, and that is what we got when we say que se vayan todos. We ended up having a catastrophically bad government. And that has happened in a lot of other countries, not to the extreme of destroying the whole nation as it happened in Venezuela, but que se vayan todos has been the rallying cry for a lot of voters and people around the world.
I think I should mention that I believe for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law, was one of my compatriotas in Peru, Oscar Benavides. At least it's been attributed to him.
It's so good that everybody wants to own it. But it's, yes, it is.
Right, that's right, yeah.
But it was Benavides, you're right.
You point out that these tactics, the pseudo-legal moves, the post-truth campaigns, the maintaining the veneer of democracy while getting rid of its substance, are being deployed all over the world in very different countries, from the United States to Bolivia. Are there transmission mechanisms? Are all these leaders responding just in the same way to similar incentives? Are they learning from one another or from history? We're in a global pandemic, but how does the contagion of these kind of ideas and tactics work?
The demonstration effect is very powerful. And nowadays, you very quickly learn what others are doing and if they work or if they don't work. So, watching others motivates and shapes the reaction and the strategies of would-be autocrats. But then there is the pure being, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And through that channel, just getting close to one another, you end up having alliances that were not obvious and they're not natural, but they make sense if what you want that ally for is is a mutually supporting group. Is a support group, and belonging to that, you can exchange tactics. It was quite striking to see how the Iranians from the government showed up in Venezuela, and they started training the people to against street demonstrations, and we also had it from Cuba. Cuba transferred to Venezuela all the practices, the best practices they have developed to retain power for over 60 years. And that includes torture, which was never known in the country, but now is common.
You mentioned, I think, that the congratulating one another on their victories in sham elections is a clear sign of this brotherhood of 3P autocrats. That the congratulatory call is meant to kind of cement those ties, but also try to confer a certain legitimacy on that process. Now, you explain in the book, Moisés, how some of the transgressions of aspiring autocrats are incremental. And they gradually scale up. For instance, you can go from small, subtle acts of corruption, like building a soccer stadium in your hometown, Donald Trump overcharging the Secret Service to stay in Trump properties, to then go to sort of bigger and more brazen transgressions. Are there other ways in which the 3P autocrats escalate? One thing I was wondering is, do you think we'll ever get to the point where they just revert to form and no longer need the facade of democracy that they are kind of pretending to uphold now?
Yes, and the way that can happen, for example, let's watch Russia. There is no scenario in which Russia will not be less prosperous in the next 5 years, even perhaps longer. Russia's economy is going to crater in very significant ways. What to do if you were Putin and you had, assume that he somehow manages to occupy and conquer Ukraine and have a puppet government there, but then he has 40 million people, a nation that is essentially very, very poor. And then the Russian people, what do? If economic performance doesn't give you the stability, the legitimacy that you need to govern, what else do you do? And if you have people in the streets and you have protests and you have people questioning your authority, well, what we have seen around the world is that the way they resort to form is that they start repressing. So if the economy goes down, repression will go up. And repression, but even that will have difficulties. And that is where my two books coincide. The End of Power explains what are the reasons, trends, and conditions that make power easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose. But then we can see how even the most authoritarian governments have to worry about these fragmenting forces.
One of the challenges that you raise near the end of the book is about the stories, the narratives that autocrats can offer and that the forces of democracy can offer. The autocrats have great stories about shadowy elites and noble people and easy solutions and vengeance against enemies. The forces of democracy are often left talking about process, about concepts, rule of law, checks and balances. These are important concepts, but they're a lot less engaging, a lot less sexy. What tools do the forces of democracy have in this battle for the narrative, as you call it in the book?
Well, surely the narrative, the liberal narrative, has to change and incorporate 21st century political realities that need to be taken and tackled very effectively, inequality being perhaps the most important one, but also the fight against climate change and global warming. There is a whole list of issues that a democratic view of the world needs to take into account. So my point is the narrative, the liberal narrative is very important and is defective. But the problem is not just to fix the narrative. You need to fix the underlying defects of the situation. So you want democracy to be better performers. You want democracy to be performing and then include the narrative there. But it's very difficult to have a weak narrative supported by a very weak condition and standards of living and everything else.
I want to ask one more question, then I'll start getting to questions that people are putting into the Q&A. If you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A. So in 2013, you wrote The End of Power. Now in 2022, you're writing about the backlash with The Revenge of Power. If you had to cast forward and imagine what you might write 8 years from now, what kind of mutations of power do you foresee? The next Moisés Naím book about power is the what of power.
What has climate change, pandemics, and artificial intelligence has done to power? Power and the mutations of power have been typically driven by great societal revolutions in many ways, but driven internally in different countries, and then they spread. But here we're talking about planetary trends. There is no doubt that global warming will change the structure of borders, of governing, of, it's going to be a big deal. And it will turn power on its head in a lot of countries. The same with pandemics. These pandemics may be almost over, but we have learned that it's not impossible that another one shows up. And we are beginning to see what, the kind of intelligence, artificial intelligence, surprises in terms of how it will have a presence in almost everything we do, including politics. So when you put these three things together, you have a book that is going to be faster. I'm not going to write it, but we need a book that explains how these three societal planetary trends will transform power, who wields it, who has it, how it is lost, how it is gained, and the hugely transformational impacts of all these three things in politics and in society.
Fiona Hill, who was the advisor on Russia to President Trump and a former intelligence officer and longstanding expert on Russia and on some of the trends that you're discussing, wrote a biography of Putin, sort of almost like a psychological profile of Putin a few years ago. And one of the things she emphasized is that he sees himself as a history man, right? Not just because he thinks he's sort of a world historical figure, but because he deploys history to his advantage. And one of the questions that has come up in the Q&A is, do the autocrats that you're talking about study the history of past leaders who have used similar tactics? Do they learn and imitate from history?
It depends. Some of them are not readers. And some of them just read texts that reinforce what they're doing. And we saw a very strange event last week when Vladimir Putin essentially described the history of Ukraine and explained how Ukraine was destined inevitably to be part of Russia again. And most experts immediately saw the holes in their reasoning and the bad data and the very carefully selected cherry picking of events and situations to just show how Putin was using that narrative to justify the invasion. So, they either read because they need to come up with a narrative or because they want to see how what they're doing is confirmed by history.
Another question here in the Q&A is about the elites that the 3P autocrats rail against and criticize. And the question though is, don't these elites actually exist? And can they not at times pose real problems?
Of course. and they are an imminent part of the problem of the situation, and we see them mushrooming around the world, and they have different drivers and different objectives. Of course, they want to continue in power, and of course, in order to do that, they have to develop strong links with society in general. But very often, they end up in cahoots with the guys with guns, with the military. So the military play a role. We forgot that in past decades, the coups were executed by generals, by a military junta. And so in one of your questions, you asked me about pseudo-law and all of those things. Well, we also have one of the characteristics, and you described it. It used to be that a change in a regime, making, a coup was done through a coup d'etat. There's generals with tanks and fighter jets and troops take power. Now it's more boring and less visible and slow. It's not an event that undermines and destroys democracy. It happens. We have seen it in Myanmar recently, for example, but that's not common. It is 20th century, 19th century kind of things. The 21st century way of doing that is drop by drop, little by little, doing very small, almost invisible to the naked eye kind of bureaucratic decisions, of legislative initiatives, and you described it well. And so what we need to pay attention is this very stealthy way of undermining the checks and balances that define a democracy.
One of the other questions here is, can you tell us how China uses the 3 Ps?
Well, let's start with the most overwhelming one, which is the social. In China, they have a social index that measures behavior and attitudes and points of view and everything. And if you have a very high rating, you have access to public services and other opportunities that others don't. So think about post-truth, the world of post-truth. And then Xi Jinping just gave a speech in which, again, he was very clear that China, in order to prosper, has to deal with a corrupt elite. It was his war on corruption, which nobody doubts that is necessary. And there is a lot of corruption in China. But what people just noted is that the corruption is against those that are his friends. That in fact he used the anti-corruption drive to get rid of leaders that attempted or that were not friendly, and he also has deployed the tools of populism several times.
One question comes from Tom Rackman, who I wonder if it's the Tom Rackman who wrote The Imperfectionists, which is a book I really enjoyed. If it's you, hi Tom. He writes, so many global trends are worrying, but could the widespread outrage regarding Putin's invasion of Ukraine signal a shift in the battle against autocracies?
I believe that this is the Tom Rackman that you mentioned. He's a dear friend and a great writer, and I'm honored to have him attending this session. And yes, he's right. Tom is right that something has changed in the past couple of weeks. And is surprising everyone, including Putin. And that is the world reacting in a different way that we have seen. The international community is showing a capacity and a willingness to act together and take tough decisions, costly and popular decisions. But they're going with this. The only caveat, of course, is that this is happening. We don't know. This is just the beginning of something. It's not the end of something. We don't know if what happens to the sanctions 6 months from now, when the negative consequences in the rest of Europe start to bite, and the coalition that has been created, the anti-Putin coalition, frails. And you can rest assured that Putin and his friends, both in Russia and outside Russia, are working overtime to try to explain how these sanctions are hurting the American people or the Europeans. So it is a good thing. I think we should celebrate it. We should hope that it stays. We should help if we can, but always be cognizant that this is just beginning.
Another question in the Q&A is a follow-up to one of your prior answers. When I asked you what kind of sort of next mutation of power might be forthcoming, how will climate change alter governments and borders? Could you give us any sort of possible scenarios or examples?
Well, start with the islands that are disappearing, and continue with tongues of territory that is disappearing and creating. There is one between Bangladesh and India that is quite significant given the density of the population there. And then in terms of the economics, the frequency of catastrophic climate events is increasing. The lethality and the costs are increasing. All the insurance companies now have their calculations. And it's quite striking to see the trend in how every single new forest fire, new, all kinds of climate events end up costing more in terms of human lives and human losses and economic losses. So, and a lot of those are going to end up in governments, so maintaining fiscal balances and maintaining a healthy economy is going to be a healthy economy, and money to keep a healthy economy and social programs and all the rest will be competing with the money that will be needed to deal with the consequences of extreme weather catastrophes.
Another question we have concerns the role of social media in affecting power. And the questioner, Mark Zation, asks, can you talk about that using the Middle East as an example? I wonder if that means, you had the Arab Spring when it seemed like social media was a great liberating force, and then it, that didn't quite work out in the way it seemed that it would. You've had social media be a sort of a retrograde force for democracy. How do you see that working out on balance and going forward?
As all technologies, they are double-edged swords. There are some wonderful things that social media can deliver, and others that are horrifying. And we have seen that. I am a techno-optimist in this aspect. I believe that in the pipeline there are technologies that are being developed that combine with new legislation and changes in education and social mores can create a more protective environment for digital consumers. We desperately need consumer law for digital users. We have it for users of medicines and food and everything else, but we desperately need protection. And there it's very hard because you have to maintain the balance with the dynamism and the innovation that characterizes the platforms and the companies that own and develop these social media. But we need to use the same creativity and intellectual capacity to develop tools that will help us, will facilitate our life as digital consumers.
Anne Young asks, what do you view as the best ways to fight autocracy here in the United States? How do we address the polarization in effective ways?
It's quite striking the number of Americans that have a very superficial information, very often distorted about what's going on. I think, there is no silver bullet. There is not one thing that can be done. It is a list of things that includes having political leaders that get it, that understand the nature of the challenge, that are capable of explaining the nature of the challenge, not as politics as usual, between different candidates vying for power, but that there, this is maybe an election, for example, that will define the future of democracy in the United States. So all of that requires a level of attention that most people don't give. Those of us that pay attention are interested in this, are not necessarily the majority. The majority is raising kids, working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet, and they don't have politics takes time. Politics is very onerous, not just in money, but in the time. And so we need to find ways in which these consumers of politics are better informed. And then, we also need to fortify our defenses against criminalized states, criminalized autocracies that exports their practices. The kinds of things that we have seen Russia doing in the United States, even interfering with the election of the presidential election, is something that one needs to pay great attention. What the Republican Party is doing in trying to influence the machinery, the logistics of democracy and voting needs to be paid attention. They are going to the kind of opaque, hard to understand, boring, difficult to get the data, not knowing what's what, and then you end up with a highly compromised infrastructure of democracy, which is an election.
Suzanne Ellers asks, how would you apply your observations regarding leadership and power to other sort of non-political organizations, corporations and nonprofits? Is the landscape shifting in a similar way?
Yes, it's, well, I say hello to my friend, Susan Ellers. What's happening essentially in the private sector in the United States especially is that the nature of the relationship between workers, employees, and the leadership has changed. Workers now have experienced alternative ways of living with remote work and everything else that the pandemic has thrown on them. So leaders need to develop personality traits and expertise and commitments that will bring them closer to the experience of their employees. Empathy is now at the top of the skill set that a leader needs to have. Empathy, the capacity to put yourself in other people's shoes and understand what can be done and what are the limits and what are the possibilities, what are the hopes and desires of others. And then there's the whole thing now, there's a whole area of research about emotions in the corporate life and in organizations where, we all know we are emotional beings, but we keep those emotions, they're not allowed in corporate context or organizational context. Little by little, they're going to show up more concretely. And organizations will also, and the leaders organization will also do well by allowing that all the consequences that it has, having understanding that emotions is part of the human condition and is present in their company or public agency or NGO.
Another question is about whether there are, we know about, we hear about Viktor Orban, we hear about Erdogan and Trump and Putin. Are there perhaps lesser known autocratic leaders that trouble you and that you think are a sign of things to come?
Yes, Mr. Petro is a presidential candidate in Colombia, and he's leading the polls. And elections are coming, and he may win the election. If you look at what he does, what he says, his performance when he was mayor of Bogota, you have reasons to worry. And he's, he checks all the boxes of the 3P autocrat. We also see some in Africa. There are several others in Asia. I think that there is a list of the juniors coming, trotting ahead and claiming their claim to fame of being the 3P technocrats that know how to manage these tools.
Another question. Is our news media up to the task of reporting on the 21st century autocrats?
No, because that requires first a recognition that this is going on, and that opaqueness, stealthiness, hiding is very important. Also, the media is doing a terrible job in explaining how these criminalized regimes end up having inordinate influence and exporting their ways of doing things. The problem also is that when we talk about the media, we are now probably making a huge injustice, because now media means different things. And, it includes your employer, the Washington Post, but also includes a podcaster or a YouTuber that influences readers or followers as much as you do as a critic. So we need to redefine what we call by media. We need to understand better the incentives that need to be aligned in order to ensure that the media, whatever way it takes, is aware and part of the battle against the 3P autocrats.
I will, take the moderator's privilege and pose the final question for you. And it's a little different from what we've been discussing. I mentioned early on that you've written a novel recently, Two Spies in Caracas. Can you describe what the experience of writing fiction versus nonfiction has been for you, and how your career as a nonfiction writer, as an editor, as a columnist, in that realm, has informed and affected your experience when you move into fiction?
That's a great question, and the answer is that it was wonderful. The writing fiction allows you not to ignore the anchors that typically constrain what you can say when you write serious nonfiction. We are fact-checked. We need to be careful. We need to have verifications. In the traditional nonfiction mode that you so masterfully exemplify. So it's wonderful to write without having fact checkers in the back of your head saying, well, can you say that? And is that really new? And all that. So you write a novel and it comes from a different combination of skills and experiences and emotions. And it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. You develop a real relationship with the characters. You talk to them. And you imagine them in certain circumstances, and it's fun. It's great fun. I strongly recommend it.
Do you have other novels in you?
I am halfway through a new novel. Yeah. Excellent.
Congratulations. Well, I'm sure. I hope we'll be discussing it here. But thank you so much, Moisés, for this conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Carlos, for doing this. And thank you, Politics and Prose, for hosting us. And thank you all who joined us streaming for being with us, discussing the Revenge of Power. Thank you all.
Thank you both. What an important and timely conversation. I wish we had more time. For all of you out there, thank you for joining us. As a gentle reminder, I've put the book link to purchase The Revenge of Power in the chat. It will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where I hope that you'll, after purchasing the book, visit our events page. We'd love to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, thank you both so much. What an engaging, wonderful conversation. Politics and Prose is honored to have hosted it. Have a good evening, everybody.